Knots are mysterious to people. And if you didn't grow up riding horses, sailing boats, climbing rocks, or in the Boy Scouts, you probably are one of those folks who just is a little bit embarrassed anytime you've got to pick up a rope with the intention of getting any work done. I want to show you the 5 knots that I use more often than anything else in the work that I do. Now here's a disclaimer. I'm not a rope master. I can just tie a few knots and I can do work with it. So don't be discouraged if you open up a book and there's 150 knots in there and they're all so complicated you can never do it. Don't worry about that. Just pick out 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 maybe knots that'll fit almost any need that you ever run across, and then use them until you've got it down. The first knot is the simplest. It's a girth hitch or a cow hitch or a Larksfoot. And it starts like this. You take a bite. This is a bite. It's a loop in the middle of the rope. And you just do that. Or even simpler derivative is you just do that. You see that? It just makes these 2 loops that will tighten up at the same time with the rope or string going 2 directions from the loop. It's handy. In construction, I can use it for tying a string to a stake or to a nail, and I can use it, if I'm careful, lifting a load, like this. So the way that you can think about doing this is make the hitch, slip it over the end of the work. Now let me emphasize, this is not for a heavy or a dangerous lift. This is just for if you're sending something up that's light, that needs to go up in a hurry, and you don't want to have to spend a bunch of time taking it apart after you're done. Because this way you can get both the attachment and a tagline. See that? As it goes up, you can also control it. Now a more legitimate use for that is for attaching a string line to a stake or a nail. Let me demonstrate what is probably a more reasonable application of this knot for lifting. You got to send a hammer up to somebody. They're too far to throw it. I mean, let's face it, it's not always good practice to throw a hammer up to somebody, but you can always make a cow hitch or a girth hitch. And look at that. I mean, and maybe we're back to that whole tagline idea where he drops you the end of the rope, you hang on to one side, he's raising it up, you're controlling it, you're keeping it out away from the window. I don't know, but there are a lot of ways you can tie on to a lot of things with something as simple as a cow hitch. So let me own this. I don't even know the difference between a hitch and a knot. So if you know the technical difference between manipulating a rope in such a way that it is a type of a hitch, which is simpler, or the much more elaborate possibilities around making knots, would you just let us know in the comments what the distinction is? But the first knot that I would like to show you, and this is a knot, and it's the king of all knots as far as I'm concerned, probably more used than anything else, is a Bolan. And you say, well, Scott, what do I need to know a Bolan for? What good is a Bolan? Well, for one thing, it will put a loop in the end of a rope that you can trust your life to. The idea and the classic description is you lay it overhand. It's the beginning of an overhand knot. You just make a loop in the bite, and then the rabbit, think of the end of the rope as the rabbit, goes into the hole and around the root, let's call that the root of the tree, and then he pops back up out of the hole. See that? That's a Bolan. Let's do that again. You just make the beginning of a loop, and then you enter that loop from the top side that you're looking at. You see that with it's laying over the top. You don't do this. You could, but the easy way for this conversation is the rope in your hand is over the top of the rope that's in your other hand. And you run the end of the rope through that hole, around that line, and back out of the hole. Leave enough bitter end projecting that it's not going to slip out, and you render it. You see that? That is a beautiful, simple, bulletproof knot. Doesn't decrease line strength much. gets tighter as it's pulled on rather than loosening, and functionally, no matter how tight you pull it, with a little messing around, you can always loosen up a Bolan and get it out. So that's the first way, to put a loop in the end that you can use. How about this? You put a Bolan in there, and now with a loop that you can trust your life to, you can pull the bight of the rope through the loop you created and choke something, right? You can throw that around and choke something, and you know that knot, that Bolan, which I didn't render very nicely, is not going to fail you. Okay, so that's two applications, loop in the end and a giant slip knot. That's pretty good. Now, if you just want to walk up to something and tie onto it with a Bolan, it's the same thing. So you want to tie onto something. You walk up to it and you throw your rope around there, and what do I do? Do I put a bunch of half hitches on there? And no. None of those are going to keep you alive if you're in a real bind. Now, are they good enough for that? Yes. But if you want something that is utterly dependable, and there are a million ways to do this, but the way I do it is with a bowline. Make that loop, drop in from the top, go around that standing part, the part that's going to take the load, and then back out of the same hole, render it down, sweet. It's not coming off until you want it to. And when you want it to, it comes right off. So practice a bowline. This knot is probably the one that I use more often when I'm building than any of the others. It is called, I named it inaccurately, I've learned, a fiddle string knot, because it can get a string fiddle string tight and hold it. I think the real name for this knot is an engineer's knot, and it goes like this. You want to hold a string tight. So what do? Do you wrap it and wrap it and wrap it and then do a hat? No, you don't do that. You just start out as if you're going fishing, and you take a bight and you twist it. 3, 4, 5, 6. I like to do it 5 or 6 times. 7 seems to be too many. 3 or 4 doesn't seem to be enough. And with it twisted, you can pull the tension from the end that is affixed, hold the tension, and then simply pull it back and it holds. Now that's part of the magic. The rest of the magic is how easily it comes apart. I worked for a guy in Las Vegas that would yell at you if you cut a roll of string line. He thought that string line should remain pristine. And I don't know how many hundreds of dollars it cost him every month to have guys untangling knots and dealing with too much line because he didn't want him to cut it. One of the problems with cutting a string line is that the line never lays as flat against the edge of a board with a knot in it as it does without a knot. And a lot of guys, when they're tying a line together, will just take an overhand knot or maybe loop it around twice, and bang, there's the knot, and it's tied together. But can you see that the knot is completely offset to one side of the string line? So you got a 1/4 of an inch there that it will hold your string line out of straight just because of the offset that the knot creates. So there's a better way, and it's called a water knot. This is a water knot. It's useful for joining 2 pieces of rope or string if you don't want to reduce the strength, if you want the line to be centered, the knot to be centered on the line, and if you want to be able to do it in a hurry and know that you've got it right. And a water knot is the same whether it's going onto a string line or a rope. Let me show you a water knot on climbing ropes so that you can see what's happening. You can use it any time you have to join 2 ends of 2 pieces of rope, or for that matter, nylon webbing of similar size together. It's so easy. You just make an overhand knot and leave lots of bitter end, right? This is the bitter end. I think we've already talked about that. And then you take the other end and you put it into this overhand knot from the direction that the other rope emerges. This pink rope emerges, and so this gray rope goes into the knot at that point, and then you keep the second line in contact with the first line as it proceeds through the knot. You see that? It remains in contact, it remains in contact, and since this is where this one goes in, this is where this one comes out. You see that? These two ropes are on the same racetrack from opposite directions. And you just render it down, and it doesn't look like much. But the beauty is it doesn't reduce line strength much, and the knot is roughly centered on the line. So with a string line, when I do the same thing, an overhand knot, insert the second string from the side of the knot that the first one emerges from, keep it in contact through the whole path of the first string, emerging from the side that the other one enters from, and render it down. The knot is roughly centered on the string. So it's quick, it's strong, and it obviates the need to yell at your guys because they cut your string. The last knot is a sheep shank. It's used for tightening a rope or shortening a rope, but I use it for tightening a rope to hold tension for a while. Quickly, easily, easy to install, easy to take out, in many ways, almost as good as a ratchet strap. You do it like this. You create a pulley in your line by taking the bitter end, which is going around one side of your load, and creating a pulley like this. You want to create a spot for a pulley action to pull everything tight, hold everything down. But you have to hold that pulley in place. I make a loop. The pulley's going to happen right there. I take this side of the rope and I slip it up through that loop so that it begins to hold itself in position. You see that? Now we have a pulley. We're going to make one more loop, come up from the bottom. See that? Now just for grins, we're going to put a little knot around there later. I'm just showing you that that is sort of a little safety tie-off to hold this pulley. Now, here's the magic. See that? It becomes a pulley. Now to hold that, you can just pinch it right there if you want. Now go around the whole ensemble. There, it's held. If you want to, you can put another knot around there to hold everything together. If you want to, you can tie off this top so you know it's not going to come apart driving down the road. I like that. And you got a nice tight line doing whatever you want it to do. Now the beauty of this compared to other truckers' knots, which can accomplish the same thing by putting a pulley in a line, is that it doesn't matter how tight or how long or how wet or how frozen this gets, you can always take it apart in a hurry. You loosen the things that are holding the mechanism. You put slack in your rope, and then these half hitches just fall apart. So you can probably think of a time on a job when somebody was told to tie this thing down or tie this thing up, and instantly that person either A, distinguished themselves and set themselves apart as a person of competence, or B, had to communicate to the whole world that they didn't have any idea what to do with a piece of rope or a piece of string. Now, whichever camp you fall into, the best scenario you can set up for yourself is being able to demonstrate proficiency in a crunch when people are watching. Who can tell? Who can tell the benefits that could come to you for being that guy? Whether it's with a string or a rope, you've got to practice. And so if I was going to recommend, I wouldn't recommend that you start practicing with poly rope. It's slippery, it doesn't hold knots very well. I think this is not quite the same kind of plastic as that. It's okay, maybe it's just because it's used. I would get some string or a cotton rope or a hemp or sisal rope, because you could practice all kinds of knots with a piece of mason's line, either braided or twisted, a piece of hemp or sisal rope, or a piece of clothesline, for crying out loud, cotton clothesline. But you've got something better to do than just sit there and play video games. I know you do. And so if you're sitting there watching something else, have a piece of rope in the chair with you and practice, so that when that moment comes, everybody will know, man, that guy can get something done. Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.